Welcome and thanks for joining us for the 9th annual edition of Humanists International's Freedom of Thought report. This is a meeting to launch that report, hear something about its conclusions and headline themes, and get some responses from distinguished participants in FoRB work around the world. My name is Andrew Copson, I'm the current president of Humanists International, and my role today is simply to chair this event. I'd like to welcome as the first speaker, who'll be launching this report and taking us through some of its findings, Emma.
Thank you, Andrew. I just want to say, first of all, what a privilege it is to be with you all here, able to talk about the report and its findings. As Andrew said, I am Emma Wadsworth-Jones. I am the Casework and Campaigns Manager at Humanists International. For those of you who may not be aware, Humanists International is the representative body of the global humanist movement, founded in 1952 in order to grow and develop humanist organisations across the globe, and in so doing promote humanist values. Today we count among our members 127 different organisations, many of whom contribute their research and their experience to the Freedom of Thought report. So I'm going to take a few minutes today to talk to you firstly about what the Freedom of Thought report actually is, and then also the key findings for this year. So what is the Freedom of Thought report? Firstly, it was founded in 2012 by the American Humanist Association, who initially looked at 30 countries and looked at the record of those countries and those states in upholding the rights of non-religious individuals. Since then, Humanists International has adopted it and expanded it, and now it largely lives online as a resource. We have country entries for every country across the globe, and you'll find a narrative for each one. We're looking at the non-religious, and I wanted to take a moment to talk about why. The reason for this is that the non-religious are a distinct group within freedom of religion or belief, as is defined in Article 18 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and they are often targeted, discriminated against, persecuted for their beliefs and or for their criticism of religion or religious practice. So while there are lots of organisations that might look at other religious groups, very few look at the treatment of the non-religious. So that's where we come in. It's important to remember that this group has universal human rights, including the right to freedom of belief and freedom of expression. So what do we take into consideration when we look at the report? Well, for each country, we look at 4 thematic areas. The first is constitution and government. The second is education and children's rights. The third is family, community and society, and the fourth is freedom of expression and the ability to advocate for humanist values. And within that, we're largely looking at the legal framework to see where the privileging of a religion or religions leads to discrimination or marginalization of the non-religious. So it could be restrictions on expression, such as blasphemy laws. It could be the application of family law. Or it could be that religious privilege leads to social prejudice and taboos, or to the extreme overt persecution and violence. So as I mentioned, we have these 4 thematic areas, and within those, we have developed what we call boundary conditions. I think we have around 70 now that apply within each of the different thematic areas, and they happen on a scale from boundary conditions that represent states that are observing the same rights for all, and there is no discrimination, they're free and equal, all the way to the dark red, brownish colour that represent grave violations. And these boundary conditions are applied based on the narrative of each of the individual reports. So let's have a look, just so that you get a sense of what grave violations might be. It could be within constitution and government, complete tyranny precluding the freedom of expression, thought, religion and belief. It could be blasphemy laws being punishable by death, or even religious and ideological indoctrination being utterly pervasive in schools. There are a whole range of things that for us constitute grave violations of the rights of the non-religious. So let's look at this in practice. Here you have the entry for Russia for this year. So as you can see, there is a paragraph, or in fact 2 paragraphs, that give you a bit of background into the country as a whole, followed by the specific boundary conditions that have been applied to Russia. And below that, if you scroll down on the website, you would see the narrative of the report, which gives you more information as to why those specific boundary conditions have been applied. I want to draw your attention to one thing here, and that is the last updated section. This is really important for us because, unfortunately, currently, we don't have the capacity to update every single country entry every year. This in spite of our wonderful members and our army of volunteers. So far, we've managed to update 75 countries this year, and I plan on updating many more before the year is out. But because of that, it's really important that readers who look at the report and look at country entries also pay attention to when it's last updated, just to double check before they use it whether they need to do a little bit of extra fact checking of their own. We like to include what we call a thumbprint, which gives you an immediate visual indicator of the performance of a country. This is generated by looking at the worst rating within each of the 4 thematic areas. So this is Russia, where you can see amber for constitution and government, and red for the other 3 categories. And this is what it looks like on the website. When you click on countries by region and select a region, all of the countries appear in alphabetical order. You see the introductory paragraph and that thumbnail there that gives you an initial indicator as to how the country is performing. The boundary conditions themselves allow us to develop these heat maps that use the same colour scale from green for free and equal to the dark red for grave violations within each of the thematic areas. But it also allows us to create one that is the summary score or the average score across all thematic areas. So you can immediately look at the globe and see how countries are performing relative to each other based on the data that we have. All of our data is open source. You can download it from the website, and I encourage you to do so. Have a look for yourself and use it. We have a Creative Commons license, so please feel free to use the information. Just make sure that you cite the report when you do so. So, what are this year's findings? Firstly, there are trends that are common throughout the years. The first being that often the places with the worst record for freedom of thought tend to be those that have the worst record for human rights more generally. And I think that that's because where thought is a crime, very few other rights will prevail. Secondly, persecution and discrimination against the non-religious and religious minorities happens across the globe to a lesser or greater extent, but there is nowhere where you're truly free of it. But where secularism is upheld in practice and not just written into a constitution, rights tend to be better respected. So every year our report has a theme. And this year, perhaps unsurprisingly, the theme is COVID-19 and its impact on the non-religious. Now, COVID-19 has affected us all in myriad ways, and in choosing this theme, we were in no way intending to diminish the experience of any other belief group, simply to focus on our mandate, which is the non-religious and those who promote humanist values. So what are the things that we found? Well, one of the first things that happened in many countries was that either prominent religious groups or states themselves were quick to say that the pandemic was a punishment from God, which led to stigmatization of the non-religious particularly and other religious minorities in a country. It led to states promoting days of national prayer in order to counteract the virus, to combat the virus, encouraging people to repent for their sins. And some individuals also promoted prayer as a cure. Where inequality already existed, we found that they've been exacerbated. So, for example, where internet penetration is poor, access to information is poor. And that means that individuals are struggling to get the information they need to protect themselves from the virus. But additionally, in, for example, Kuwait, where 2/3 of the population are migrant workers who are subject to the kafala system, they live in overcrowded conditions and have very poor access and inadequate access to medical care, and that is being exacerbated. Or, for example, in Korea, where in May 2020, the media mistakenly said that a gay nightclub was responsible for an outbreak of COVID-19, which led to increased hostility and harassment of the LGBT community there. Or you can look at the case of Hungary, where the state used the COVID emergency bill in order to roll back rights and to roll back the recognition of trans people in the country. In countries where they have a conservative, religious, ideological view, women's rights are often impacted negatively. And this has been compounded by COVID-19 as well. So restrictions have meant that women have struggled to access services such as abortion, such as contraceptives. This isn't the case everywhere. For example, in the UK, the government sought to enable women to access abortion safely at home where possible, and they are considering whether they can maintain that facility once restrictions are lifted. Also, you see that there is increased violence against women during lockdown, also against minorities, not just women. And it's often where it was prevalent in the first place, but now in this lockdown climate where people can't escape, they're much more vulnerable than before. States have used COVID-19 as a pretext to restrict freedom of expression, the media, and assembly. They have increasingly used pre-existing legislation to crack down on disinformation or false information, fake news, or legitimate criticism, such as in Bangladesh, where in May, they arrested 16 journalists under the Digital Security Act alone. Further, they harassed doctors, activists, students who were critical of the government's approach. In Russia, they enacted new legislation in order to crack down on false information during the pandemic, which has been used to arrest journalists who are covering the state's handling of the virus. States have also used allegations of violating restrictions in order to arrest protesters, for example. Breaking lockdown rules has been a really great way to arrest individuals who are dissenting. I'd like to take a moment to reflect a bit on discrimination and persecution as it is experienced by the non-religious, because it's not just external, it happens in the home as well. And under COVID-19, under the restrictions that everyone across the globe is experiencing, the non-religious are particularly vulnerable. This is because they're at risk from their family too. So when they're at home, they are being forced to simulate religion, to observe religious festivals, to pray, to profess values that they don't hold, which go fundamentally against their own beliefs. And that is really psychologically damaging. But if they don't do that, they risk scapegoating, they risk discrimination, they risk violence. And because of the lockdown, they aren't able to relocate to a safer place, be it within the country itself or outside. And finally, I just want to take a moment to also reflect on the non-religious or even the religious who promote humanist values, who were in prison prior to the COVID-19 outbreak, who are kept in conditions which are often overcrowded, where they rarely have adequate access to medical care, and where often they are subject to torture as prisoners of conscience. In these circumstances, their immune system, they are particularly vulnerable to contracting illnesses, and there is not a system in place to support them. The conditions in which they're held are actually likely to foster the spread of the virus. So, what do I hope that you take away from what I've presented? Firstly, that the non-religious are a distinct group within freedom of religion or belief as protected under Article 18 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and that within that we should try and seek to use the term freedom of religion or belief, or FoRB, rather than religious freedom, because that excludes a whole group of individuals who are being targeted because of their beliefs. That these individuals do have human rights and the rights to freedom of thought and freedom of expression. That discrimination, be it legal or social, is pervasive, and that in some states it is outright persecution. And that the COVID-19 pandemic has been used to justify the intensification of persecution and discrimination against the non-religious globally. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Emma, for that presentation of this year's report. As I said at the beginning, we're very lucky to have very distinguished respondents to this report. And so we start straight away with Dr. Ahmed Shaheed, who is the current United Nations Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Religion or Belief. Dr. Shaheed assumed his mandate as Special Rapporteur back in November 2016. I can't believe it was so long ago. It seems like only yesterday, Ahmed. And he's also Deputy Director of the Human Rights Centre at Essex University. As a career diplomat in his former life, he was twice Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Maldives, leading that country's efforts to embrace international human rights standards and pioneering that sort of work, as he continues to do in relation to the specific universal human right of freedom of religion or belief. So, Dr. Shaheed, we're really pleased to have you here today, and we're very much looking forward to hearing your reflections on this, our 9th annual report.
Thank you, Andrew. Really honored to join the distinguished set of co-panelists today, and really pleased to see today Sheikh Ould with us, to join us for these important reflections on the very useful report. And thank you, Emma, also for a very useful presentation, if a sobering one in terms of what's going on. I think it's very appropriate that you do focus on the COVID-19 pandemic. I think that has served as a stress test for many countries, bringing out authoritarian tendencies wherever they were latent, perhaps, and certainly emphasizing them more when they were more overt before as well. I think really good to focus on the way the COVID pandemic has intensified the plight of humanists the world over. A couple of years back, I did say that in my reporting, I find that although almost everybody is persecuted when they are a minority, the attacks on humanists are particularly violent when they're exposed to harm in the community that they live. And of course, for them, the family is not a safe place. For many of them, not a safe place. And the COVID pandemic, therefore, intensifies that. The point you made about the term religious freedom is a very valid one. I think we tend to forget that the human right is freedom of thought, conscience, and religion or belief. In actual fact, that 1948, when this right was framed, we began with a very important phrase, the first article. All human beings are free, are born free and equal in dignity and rights, and are endowed with reason and conscience. And of course, we ground the entire human rights framework on reason and dignity. Of course, today, what do we hear? We talk about human rights being scaled back to whatever God would allow it to be. So we've gone from a very secular understanding, a humanist understanding of human rights, to what is now becoming a very religiously motivated understanding of human rights, which tends to therefore exclude some communities, despite us saying that in the development agenda that we will leave no one behind. But I think the humanists are the invisible people of the 21st century. In many societies, we don't talk about them. We talk about the Abrahamic faith, we talk about the other majority religions, but very often do not speak about the humanists. So the freedom of thought is an important one. You should also, I think, bear in mind that when Article 18 was framed, for a long while it was framed as freedom of conscience, meaning, in fact, to say that we have the right not to be pushed into things by all these organized religious groups. They became freedom of thought and conscience. It remained that for a long time until the very end, the word religion was added. So you can see, as a component of this right, freedom of thought, freedom of conscience are very vital to the human rights framework. Just want to point out that in the four elements that you bring out in a report, and I would say the report is an extremely useful resource for anybody who wants to work in this field. But the four elements are crucial. Looking at the legal framework in terms of how that provides a space or does not provide a space, people to be who they are or what they are. And then the education dimension. There's one area, I think, in which nearly all governments in the world are failing to really respect the the parental liberties to raise children according to their moral convictions, therefore to respect that people might want to be free from organized religion in the way they want to understand the world and engage with that. And of course, the family and society, social dimension. Again, in a world of increasing religiosity, a very, very important thing to have that space for the individual to be able to, enjoy their rights. And of course, finally, the final, aspect of expression that is so fundamental to every human right. Whether you want to claim that right and defend that right, or in the case of freedom of thought, being able to express that thought. There is no human dignity or there's no human agency without freedom of thought. No other human right can come without freedom of thought. And of course, from thought, you need to go to manifestation, to expression. And we find around the world either direct blasphemy laws or some other version of it used to suppress dissenters. And most frequently, these would be humanists in almost all jurisdictions. So I think there's an excellent report. I recommend it to all to look at it. And of course, use the very invaluable insights in that to advance for everyone the right to be who they are and to be free from repression and persecution. Thank you very much.
Dr. Shaheed, thank you. And thank you for your sterling efforts in protecting the universality in particular of this human right, which everyone, I think, in the humanist movement across the world, as in many religious organizations too, absolutely applauds. Amid the difficulties this year, which are detailed in the report, including the terrible effects of COVID-19 restrictions on non-religious people, as so many other people are already vulnerable, we're very glad to have been able to report at least 2 conspicuous successes. And one of those is the safe release of our next respondent. Mohamed Cheikh Ould Mkhaitiir is a Mauritanian blogger who was a political prisoner from 2014 to 2019, sentenced to death for apostasy after he wrote an article critical of Islam and the caste system in Mauritania, after which he became a designated prisoner of conscience by Amnesty International. Humanists International helped launch a campaign in 2014 to advocate for his release, and now 6 years later, his release has been negotiated with the authorities in Mauritania. He was originally arrested in January 2014 after he published his blog that spoke of slavery and discrimination, including against the so-called blacksmith caste to which he belongs. Following the publication of his post on social media, mass protests calling for his execution took place across the country. And at one of these protests, the president of Mauritania addressed the crowd sympathetically in apparent defense of Islam against supposed blasphemy. Following his original one-day trial and several delayed legal proceedings with various irregularities over the years, the charges against him were finally dropped following a final appeal court hearing in November 2017. Cheikh now lives in exile in France due to concerns for his safety, where we're very pleased to have him join us from now. Cheikh, welcome.
شكرا جزيلا لكم وسعيد جدا بكوني معاكم، على الرغم من أن هذه المنظمة بالضبط كانت من بين أول المنظمات اللي تعرفت عليها من بعد دخولي للسجن. سعيد جدا باللقاء معاكم. هنا أود الحديث عن القضية بشكل عام ومختصر، وعن وضعية حقوق الإنسان والحريات الدينية في منطقة الساحل أساساً. بشكل عام وضعية حقوق الإنسان وخصوصاً الحريات الدينية في منطقة الساحل التي هي موريتانيا، النيجر، مالي، تشاد. هذه وضعية في بالغ السوء، وكثيراً ما أقول في جميع خرجاتي الإعلامية أن هناك نوعية من ازدواجية المعايير في التعامل مع الحريات الدينية في هذه المنطقة مقارنة مع مناطق أخرى مجاورة. عن وجود منظمة مثل Humanists International، أنا شخصياً لدي تجربة شخصية معها أثناء الحكم بالإعدام علي. كانت وجود هذه المنظمة تمثل أمل كبير لي، وسلطت الضوء هذه المنظمة كثيراً على ما يحدث في موريتانيا، على الرغم من أن الوضعية كانت بالكاد متجاهلة من جميع الجهات المعنية بهذا الموضوع. وهيومانيست انترناسيونال قدمت المسألة أمام الأمم المتحدة وسلطت عليها الضوء، ولكن بشكل عام هناك نوع من كما أشرت ازدواجية المعايير في التعامل مع منطقة الساحل. اليوم إلى حد الساعة ما زلنا نعيش تحت ظل هذه الاضطهاد الديني بجميع أشكاله. وهنا سأستغل الفرصة لوجود شخص مثل المقرر الأممي أحمد شهيد بيننا، وهو صراحة نحن فخورون بتواجده معنا هذا المساء. ولكن أريد أن أرسل رسالة من خلاله إلى الأمم المتحدة لأقول لها نعم، نحن نعلم أنه في السعودية، في إيران، في الصين، في كوريا الشمالية هناك بعد جيوسياسي وجيو استراتيجي، ولكن في إفريقيا يوجد بشر يجب أن يسلط عليهم الضوء أيضا، على الأقل بشكل متساوي، لأننا نلاحظ وهذه مسألة أصبحت تشكل نوع من عدم الإيمان أو عدم الاعتقاد فيما تقوم به الأمم المتحدة. نحن نلاحظ أن هنالك تركيز حقوق، كلما كان هنالك حجم اقتصادي للدولة وقيمة استراتيجية وقيمة اقتصادية للدولة، كلما كان الإنسان أكثر قيمة فيها. حتى لا أطيل عليكم أدخل في قضية الكوفيد، لأن الكوفيد أثر كثيرا على قضية حقوق الإنسان والحريات الدينية. نحن كنا نتابع منذ أيام وبصحبة Humanists International، حيث كنت على التواصل شبه أسبوعي مع قاسم الغزالي حول قضية معتقلين في موريتانيا، كانوا معتقلين بتهمة الرداء وتهمة زندقة. تمكنا من خلال الضغوط التي تمت ممارستها حقوقيا على موريتانيا من إخراج هؤلاء الأشخاص من السجن منذ أسبوع. ولكن الدولة الموريتانية، أريد أن أقدم شيء لمحة سريعة عن الدولة الموريتانية. الدولة في قوانينها هي قوانين ظالمة للملحدين واللادينيين، ولكن حتى لو قامت الدولة بإطلاق سراح بعض الأشخاص المتهمين بتهم كهذه لا تستطيع حمايتهم في الشارع. لذلك بعد إطلاق سراح هؤلاء الأشخاص الذين ذكرت آنفا منذ أسبوع، احنا اضطررنا إلى أن نجد لهم مخبئا داخل في مكان ما من نواكشوط، وهم الآن مختبئون فيه، لا يمكنهم الخروج إلى الشارع، لأن السفر خارج موريتانيا لا يمكن الآن بسبب الكوفيد. هذا فقط من حيث التعقيب على قضية تأثير الكوفيد، حتى على إنقاذ الآخرين، إنقاذ الأشخاص من الموت. أصبح الكوفيد مؤثر جدا في هذه القضية، قضية التنقل ما بين الدول. أن القضايا الصحية لها الأولوية على جميع القضايا بشكل عام، ولكن هذا لا يمنع من التفكير بشكل مشترك في وضع استراتيجية لحماية هؤلاء في ظل هذه الأزمة التي نعيشها، الأزمة الصحية التي نعيشها الآن. على العموم أنا أشكركم على هذه الفرصة، وسعيد جدا باللقاء معكم، لأني حتى في السنوات اللي قضيتها في السجن كنت أحلم أني أخرج منها وأشاهد هذه الوجوه أمامي.
Thank you, Sheikh. Well, we're very pleased to see you here, and thank you very much for those responses and reflections on what we've heard. And thank you too for your courage, the courage of your advocacy, which I know we all salute. I'm sure everyone here salutes it, and I know that all of our members across the humanist movement globally do as well. It's particularly important, of course, to hear you speak of Africa and the need for an emphasis, a re-emphasis on states in Africa, jurisdictions in Africa which we know are neglected. Humanists International maintains its delegation to the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, and that's extremely important that we do that. And of course, this year, one of our most notorious cases has been the case of Mubarak Bala, the president of the Humanist Association of Nigeria, totally arbitrarily detained for so many months without representation. And those cases are too often neglected. We're very pleased as our next respondent to have one of our latest board members at Humanists International, newly elected at the General Assembly this year, but bringing with her 2 decades of activism and organising within non-religious organisations, Davie Goddard, who is currently the Vice President of American Atheists, but has been involved in her time with many different freethinker, humanist and skeptic groups and organisations in the United States. Previously, she worked in campus and community programs at the Center for Inquiry in New York, an organization that will be very well known to many of those involved in humanist organizations around the world, founded by the late Paul Kurtz, and also directed African Americans for Humanism. In 2012, she led a large billboard campaign featuring Black atheists, and in 2009 coordinated an international campaign highlighting blasphemy laws and free expression, which of course dovetails brilliantly with the work that she's now going to be starting with us at Humanists International. She's frequently involved in activism and at conferences across North America. We're very pleased to have her here to provide a response from that region to this year's report. Debbie.
Thank you. It's a real honor to be included on this panel with such distinguished panelists on this for this important report. I've been watching it every year that it's come out. I was involved with the International Blasphemy Rights Day campaign when that was more active at the Center for Inquiry, and it's been a great resource for human rights work and the different smaller campaigns we organized as part of our global campaign for free expression at the Center for Inquiry. So I was thinking about what it is in the United States that's given the most concern regarding freedom of expression. You know, we're very proud of the way that we were founded as a secular nation, had the first secular constitution. There are ideas of Americanness that are wrapped up in freedom, but there have been new challenges to that. The first one that came to mind was the warping of freedom, of religious freedom as an idea, that what we now have to call in the secular activism community religious equality, because religious freedom as a term has been misused to mean a certain privileging of a narrow kind of Christianity. And so in our government, in our current administration, the Trump administration, there are several leaders who have talked about this kind of religious freedom that they're interested in defending. Are probably one of the more toxic examples, I would say, if I can, is our Attorney General William Barr, who's actually attacked in presentations he's given militant secularists, he says, who are behind a campaign to destroy traditional moral order in the United States. Now, this is our Attorney General. This limits our ability to make changes at some level if the people in top leadership positions see militant secularists as the enemy. Of course, he's not the only one in the administration who's bringing this. Our Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, speaks frequently about seeing his role in the US government as serving God, however imperfectly, which I believe is highlighted in the report. And even our internal institutions like our public education system, which is established to be a secular public education system, has been facing new threats these last few years. From our Secretary of Education, Betsy DeVos, who has, again, privileged an idea of religious freedom, which allows religious schools and teachers to discriminate based on their beliefs. The ones who are most frequently targeted, of course, the ones who suffer from this are religious minorities, humanists, and LGBTQ students in particular. A second area of concern is the increasing demonization of the media and misuse of the media, and that can mean a lot of different things. Of course, the media landscape has changed a lot with the internet. Now we can talk about Twitter and Facebook as media resources, as American companies that can set policy that affect people around the world. And we have people in positions of power in the United States, including our president, who seem to want to affect policy, certainly are reflecting their opinions in these public spaces, while calling the news, the general news media, what used to be a pretty trusted institution, more and more the public is losing confidence in it because he's saying it's fake news. Anything that is reported in the media that they don't like is called fake news, and some portion of our populace believes that it's fake. But he's also challenging free expression more directly. I saw a recent tweet where he said, nobody should be allowed to burn the American flag. If they do, there must be consequences, perhaps loss of citizenship or a year in jail. Now, burning the American flag is a symbolic act which our Supreme Court has defended and said can do. When Trump says things that could be related to policy in this way, it suppresses people's ability to express things freely, of course. And there may be changes in our near future, unfortunately, with changes to the US Supreme Court, some recent additions of more conservative members who are less interested in preserving the Constitution the way that humanists understand it can actually affect our laws and policy pretty quickly in the near future. The third is that the United States, of course, one of the largest countries in the world, has an outside level of influence on policy, laws, and social conditions around the world. And we export a certain kind of Christian-influenced bigotry, hate, and discrimination around the world, not just through some of our international policies, but also through organizations based in the US that are very powerful and large. One of the most influential of these is the Alliance Defending Freedom, which I believe has a budget of over $40 million, has lawyers based in countries around the world, and has focused on advancing policies against LGBTQ equality, policies against what we're calling religious equality that can discriminate against religious minorities of different kinds, and policies that harm women because they promote more conservative rules against abortion and they harm reproductive choice. They have had an effect in countries including Brazil, Kenya, Italy, different parts of Africa, different parts of South America, and Russia in particular, affecting laws on same-sex marriage, affecting services that can be provided to people. They're not the only organization doing this. And so as I read through the report and saw some of the changes in countries or some of the issues that different countries might be facing, you can see the fingers of groups like the Alliance Defending Freedom affecting these policies in other places. Of course, it's not just these non-governmental organizations that are doing this. One of the most influential policies in the US that I am very concerned about related to the pandemic is our global gag rule, which has been around now for almost 40 years and forbids the US from providing healthcare related funding to organizations that promote, from their perspective, promote or provide services for abortion. And President Trump has been interested in expanding this gag rule to not just apply to what it's currently covering, but also to include government contracts. Now, if related to the pandemic, if or when, hopefully when a vaccine is produced, this could be distributed through US funded sources because the US is a wealthy nation and helps provide healthcare services or fund healthcare around the world. But what if tied to that is this ban against providing vaccines or funding to get vaccines to any healthcare related contractors or institutions that also provide any sort of abortion services? That would be a massive harm to some of our most marginalized people, which is often the case with these issues regarding freedom of expression, is the people who get hurt are religious minorities, humanists, women, particularly the poor women, and other minorities. They're the ones who suffer most. And so watching these things that happen in the US and recognizing the effect that they can have in other places, as well as seeing the changes that have happened in the US, it really tells us that there's a lot that we still have to fight to defend and promote here.
Thank you, Debbie. Thank you very much. The United States, of course, in some respects, has in the past been a very great inspiration to the humanist movement globally and to other secularists globally as well. Of course, the first state in the Western world to formally separate church and state, to introduce freedom of religion or belief, no religious tests for office, freedom of expression as a fundamental right. And of course, we look forward to the future when it will be an inspiration and a beacon for those things, again, to an even greater extent. In that connection, I'm very pleased to introduce our final respondent at the event to launch this year's report, the Reverend Frederick A. Davie. He's the Executive Vice President of the Union Theological Seminary in the City of New York, where he's also very active in city and political public life. He served on President Barack Obama's transition team, performing agency reviews for faith-based and community initiatives, and accepted an appointment by President Obama to the White House Council on Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships. As a member of the White House Council, he provided counsel on strategies for more effective partnerships between federal agencies and community organizations. He provided leadership for the inclusion of non-traditional families and marginalized populations in policy formation. And he is a commissioner on the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom. Fred, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Andrew, and thank you, Emma, as well for that presentation. I want to thank Humanists International for convening this conversation in this meeting and inviting me to participate in what is such a timely, as we've heard, and important discussion. As Andrew said, my name is Fred Davie, and I am the commissioner with the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, or USCIRF as we call it. USCIRF is an independent, bipartisan commission mandated by the U.S. Congress to monitor religious freedom conditions around the world, and to inform and advise Congress and the administration on how to better protect freedom of religion and belief abroad. I'm so pleased to have this opportunity to forge stronger connections with the global humanist community. USCIRF advocates that all faiths and creeds, including humanists, atheists, and non-religious individuals, have the right to freely believe as they wish without fear of persecution. Unfortunately, and as we've heard, non-believers can sometimes be left out of this conversation, but USCIRF is committed to countering this tendency because we know what everyone here today knows, which is that the humanist community has played and will continue to play a critical role in the fight for the protection of freedom of thought and belief worldwide. One of the ways that I have worked to protect the rights of non-religious individuals around the world as a commissioner is by adopting someone who we've already talked about today, a prominent Nigerian humanist advocate, Mubarak Bala, through USCIRF's Religious Prisoners of Conscience project. Mubarak, as you know, who is the president of the Humanist Association of Nigeria, has faced numerous violations of his rights because of his beliefs. In 2014, he was committed to a psychiatric ward against his will and drugged and held for 3 days merely for expressing his humanist beliefs, as others have mentioned. In April, Mubarak was arrested on suspected charges of blasphemy for insulting the Prophet Muhammad in a Facebook post. He was transferred to Kano State, where he may be illegally tried in a Sharia court and sentenced to death, despite the fact that he is not Muslim. Through USCIRF's Religious Prisoners of Conscience project, I've committed to doing whatever is within my power to ensure he is released and his safety and well-being are provided for so that he can return to his wife and newborn son and live without fear of further persecution. I think the focus today on the impact of the coronavirus pandemic is extremely prescient. And I want to reflect on how this pandemic has impacted Mubarak's case in particular. Since his arrest in April, Mubarak has been detained without charge and was for months denied access to his legal team, in part due to complications and chaos arising from a particular strong outbreak of COVID-19 in Kano State, where he's being held. Limits to travel, closures of local courts, and general confusion meant that those aiming to support Mubarak were unable to access him or get information they needed to help protect him. The closure of the courts in Nigeria's Abuja capital, in order to contain the spread of the virus, further contributed to a delay in justice for Mubarak, as the federal court was not able to sit and hear the fundamental rights case that Mubarak's lawyers had filed on his behalf until just last month. In the interim, Mubarak has been detained because the coronavirus has affected how the courts there operate. And in addition, in prison, in his prison, there's concern over the transmission of the virus among prisoners and as well as other detainees. Unfortunately, Mubarak is just one of many in this situation, as we've talked about. The global crisis, be they wars, pandemics, or ecological catastrophes, do not impact everyone equally. Often it is the oppressed, the disenfranchised, and the marginalized that feel the brunt of these crises in disproportionate measure. That is why the work you all are doing to keep the fight going is so crucial at this time. It is really an honor to be seated among all of you, even though virtually, and to get to participate in this important discussion. I will end my remarks here and look forward to hearing from my fellow panelists, you, and engaging in a discussion that can help ensure the rights of Mubarak Bala and all other non-religious individuals around the world are protected and respected. Thank you.
Thank you, Fred, and thank you, everyone. Thank you to all our panelists and respondents, and to Emma for joining us today. And thank you to all of those of you who are viewing. Read the report, download it, look up your country, see how well it's doing in the rankings. And if it's not doing that well, or even if it is doing quite well, think about how you can make it even better and work to that change. Thank you once again, and congratulations to all the team on a great report.